I get a lot of feedback on from the Shadow Strike series, particularly from readers who are current or former military or law enforcement. When you're writing it, it's just hearing their voices, seeing what they do, and kind of being a fly on the wall to transcribe all that as quickly as you can, finding solutions to the many obstacles you encounter each day. And I think that's been a pretty direct translation of writing, from breaking into the industry with no connections, no history of writing fiction, it being a very daunting thing and just being like, all right, like figure it out. What I love getting is emails from the military guys, including the old vets, the retired law enforcement guys, the active law enforcement guys, first responders that have been in traumatic, high adrenaline situations that reach out and are like, you nailed it.
That was Jason Kasper, USA Today bestselling author of 21 books to date. Today, I am joined by a special guest interviewer, THM CEO and founder, and bestselling author Andrew Watts, as we speak with author Jason Kasper. Before becoming a writer, Jason served in the U.S. Army, starting as a Ranger private and rising to Green Beret captain. A West Point graduate and veteran of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, Jason brings a wealth of real-world experience to his novels. His Shadow Strike series has over 20,000 five-star reviews. Today, Andrew and I chatted with him about writing thrillers, his background as a Green Beret, and his expert advice to other authors. Let's dive in and hear more from Jason.
Jason, how has your military background shaped the way you approach writing action scenes and military operations in your novels?
First, just having the experience makes it somewhat easier to write about. The main challenge in doing is just keeping the authenticity from the experiences and translating it into a fictional context. So I don't have anything in my books, despite popular belief from a lot of my readers. I don't have anything that's like an actual mission. Thank God in most cases, because they don't end up well for the most part due to narrative drive. For me, it's bringing that sense of anticipation, adrenaline, the moment by moment reactions to a gunfight, and translating that into a fictional scenario that provides me, pretty much total freedom to orchestrate things however I want to keep the story going.
You served in the military, you served as a Ranger and a Green Beret. How do those experiences influence your writing?
So the Ranger aspect comes into play a lot more in the American Mercenary series. Rangers, they're a lot more kinetic. There's, when those guys come into an objective, it's not subtle. Like the helicopters come in and they're there and it's going to be very fast and violent. I think the Green Beret side comes in a lot more through the Shadow Strike series where, it's a small group of guys using very inventive methods to get into and out of a country or hostile terrain, and then working with, local sources that are vetted through the CIA for transport, resupply, and accomplishing their aims however they need to. And also there's a lot more of the team aspect in intelligence collecting and using that to drive follow-on objectives, and then pretty much zero expectation of support from the time they come into an area till the time they leave, which forces, some pretty inventive methods to get things done and stay alive.
So for the layman, like you kind of alluded to this already, but if Rangers are going on a mission, to use a layman term, like how many people would that be? And like how many helicopters and all that? And how would that compare to Green Berets?
Platoon of Rangers is going to be, 35 to 40 people with attachments and enablers. They could all fit into one like MH-47 Chinook helicopter, or it could be like 10 per in Blackhawks, about 4 or 5, MH-6 Little Birds. For the 5-man team, they might be parachuting in, they might be using like a smuggler route to get in. I've got one book where they're using literally for a portion of their infill over the mountains, like they're using donkeys to load their equipment on a ride, which I've done in training before.
You guys had to train with donkeys?
Yeah.
Did you name it, or did you get attached to it? Or
Phil, yeah, we had a deep emotional connection. It was just kind of like the first time we looked into each other's eyes. Yeah. It was sad to leave him behind, but
you're
I trained with
right now, right? You're not.
Oh, yeah.
You're not. Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, 100. I remember it like it was yesterday, Andrew. Thanks for asking.
When you think about Green Berets, your time with the Green Berets versus your time with the Rangers, like how do those dynamics influence the character relationships that you have in your novels, and like any dialogue? Are there differences between the way different communities in the military talk to each other or interact, and how does that influence your writing?
Yeah, so the Rangers are a lot more structured, regimented. The main thing that carries over into my writing is like the Green Beret aspect. We have a small team. Everybody's relying on one another to stay alive, and that results in the best team banter imaginable. There's no barriers. There is no filter. Nobody gets offended because everybody knows they're in it together. A lot of gallows humor, and that makes it into the series quite a bit. And that's actually something that I get a lot of feedback on from the Shadow Strike series, particularly from readers who are current or former military or law enforcement. I've even had guys from Vietnam, like super elite recon units, be like, this banter brought me back to that experience. And I almost get that more than like, oh, the gunfights brought me back.
Right.
So I think those interpersonal dynamics are pretty huge in the series.
Well, you and I have discussed that with like W.E.B. Griffin with some of his writing. Some of those books that he would write, they would almost just like cut out any of the combat scenes, and everything would be the banter around it or the drama and the soap opera. I felt like it was tricking men into reading like a soap opera, because half of it has to do with the women and marriages and girlfriends and all this stuff. And, but it's in a military setting. So, and it's got like weapons and rank insignia on the front cover. So clearly you're not reading romance,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, he did it effectively because I read that series, and, by the last book, I was like, wait a minute, where was the war? Because, everything is before and after combat missions. Pretty interesting strategy, but pulled me into the soap opera. So I give him credit.
Yeah, it seems like you got both of you. Kind of like on that same note about the dynamic personalities that your characters have. And reviewers have said this so many times that your characters all have their own deep personal personalities. And that's what makes them love each of them. So are there any particular friends or people that you've encountered in your time in the military whose traits have directly influenced David Rivers or maybe other characters from your series?
David Rivers is to some extent a self-portrait, or at least he was when I started the series. The rest of the characters, I don't have one person that I've directly overlaid into a character, but there are characters that are definitely amalgamations of certain people I've known in their traits. And, for the most part, I kind of used that when I was initially creating the character, maybe in their first scene or two. And then after that, each character kind of takes on a life of their own. On the best of days, when you're writing, it's just hearing their voices, seeing what they do, and kind of being a fly on the wall to transcribe all that as quickly as you can.
Back to your time in the military, are there any like mindsets or was the training that you had, does that help you in your writing process at all? Any lessons learned that you've applied to your writing process today? Yeah,
so the biggest thing, I guess, like a Green Beret philosophy. So those guys are, small teams put in with no support, no assistant, with very broad missions, like link up with this guerrilla force or link up with this host nation force and conduct, unconventional warfare, conduct counterinsurgency operations. So very broad guidance, pretty much near total autonomy, very little oversight. The kind of mindset that comes out of that is like, figure it out. Like, nobody's coming to help you. You've got the guys in your team, and it's just about finding solutions to the many obstacles you encounter each day. And I think that's been a pretty direct translation of writing, from breaking into the industry with no connections, no history of writing fiction. And just it being a very daunting thing, and just being like, all right, like, figure it out. Doing whatever it takes, talking to whoever I, have to talk to like get information or get advice or mentorship. And then certainly throughout the writing process, like whenever I get stuck on a plot point, or I write myself into a corner, or I'm starting a new book, and which is always somewhat daunting. It just kind of goes back to that sort of like, nobody's coming to give you the magic answer. And it just becomes about like making progress however you possibly can.
Recently, in the past few years, there's been a lot of advances in AI tools. Are there any AI tools that you use today, and how do you use AI in your writing, if at all?
I know a lot of authors, I think people in general, viewing AI with fiction in particular is like, oh, it'll never be able to capture, the ephemeral sense of humanity that a person can depict. I don't have any reservations about using AI. In my mind, if I could build a better mousetrap, if something makes the writing process smoother, more fluid, and most importantly, makes the finished product better, like, I will do it. So AI right now, I use ChatGPT for brainstorming. It's phenomenal being able to bounce ideas back and forth. Give me this is what I want to accomplish. Give me variations of how I can go about it. That's been immensely helpful. Also, my research time has dropped by about 90%, especially for, equipment technology. Whereas before I would have to have 10 different Google tabs open and be sifting through, the paid placements and the ads, and trying to get the research done, to just being able to tell ChatGPT, like, I'm looking at this specific equipment. How does it work? What are the implications? And getting like a direct answer. That's been extremely helpful. So the last book I've written, and this is without ChatGPT writing any dialogue, I will add that it helps with the setting details. For me, I jump in with the dialogue and the character actions. And then I almost get to the end of the scene. I'm like, oh, I have to introduce, it's morning, they're on a desert plateau, whatever. And getting ChatGPT to generate the setting details has been immensely useful. You do have to watch it because everything it generates has long shadows, for example. There's certain buzzwords it clings to. Yeah. I've tried getting it to write like at night, under night vision, dimly lit room, brightly lit desert, triple canopy jungle with the light filtering through the trees, and something is always casting long shadows. So for authors using it, you're going to become acquainted pretty quickly with the things it always goes to and the repetitions that it has. But that stuff's an easy tweak. And overall, using ChatGPT in the way I just described, my last book, I shaved a month off my production process, really? with the only difference basically being using that instead of going and doing research and everything the hard way.
And so it shaved a month off your writing process, and that's mainly helping you with like coming up with descriptions, outlining, giving you detail on different equipment. And when you say equipment, you mean like weapons, or what's an example of equipment that it might help you with?
For my genre, it's mainly like weapons, aircraft, could be satellites, advanced surveillance technology. But overall, anything you need to ask it about, particularly, also, I want to write a book set in this province of this country. What are the dynamics? Who are the violent extremist organizations? What's the government presence? And it spews all that out. Whereas previously I was reading travel reports and defense journal accounts. I'd say easily it shaved 90% off my research time. And that, in addition to the other factors like brainstorming, setting details, translates into like a much more streamlined production process for me personally.
So one of the things that Severn River Publishing, and you know this, that we've always tried to work with authors that had really impressive backgrounds in some unique area. We've got lawyers writing legal thrillers and people like you writing, military fiction or something along those lines. We have a submarine commander that writes like Tom Clancy style novels. And that one, they can write authentically, but two, it cuts down the amount of research they have to do because they just have this body of knowledge, built up. And so it's interesting to hear that like some of these AI tools are going to quote unquote democratize that and make it available to a lot of different authors that might not have a certain background,
Yeah, and even if you have the background, like I've found myself just where I've been out of it for years. And I wrote a medical scene, for instance, a long time ago where I used a particular kind of tourniquet, which is what I learned when I came in the Army and I was with the Rangers. And then I sent my medical scenes I always do to a special operations combat medic. And he was like, dude, that's like a Gen 1 tourniquet. What are you even talking about? And I thought about it. I was like, oh, yeah, I haven't used those since like 2003. And I completely mentally lapsed over, the type of tourniquet that I used when I was at the end of my military career. So, just because you have a background in an area, if you're not actively working in it, there's a lot that you can forget, particularly when you're writing a rough draft. You're trying to get to the end, you're looking at the blank page and you're getting it all down. And then in the rewrite process, you have to find those little details. But AI has been extremely helpful for that.
Have you used any other AI tools that you find impressive?
I've played around with Pseudowrite a little bit. The only feature of it I've really used is, you can take a specific sentence you're writing and then tell it like, I need new text, and then describe what you're trying to say or what you are trying to represent in sensory terms or visual terms. And it'll generate, 4 different options in the sidebar using various AI models that you can kind of pick and choose or combine into what you want. For me so far, maybe it's just because I haven't used it that long or played around with it that much. That's been a lot more like minor of an effect.
Yeah, so kind of moving away from the AI more into your own personal writing, can you walk us through your process of developing a thriller from initial brainstorming to outlining?
The initial brainstorming, like again, ChatGPT can help with that. Once you have your idea, you can plug it in, ask for variations, ask how to thread the gap between two plot points that you want. So once I have the basic idea for the story, I have literally a giant cork board with headings for the general story progression for any story, right? Setup, inciting incident, complications, midpoint, the darkest hour, the climax, the resolution. And then I kind of take my initial idea and just start throwing it up on note cards, pinning it on under the relevant plot points. And that kind of helps reveal what are the gaps, what have you not considered so far. And I kind of sit with that corkboard until I've filled the entire thing out with note cards. The key point here and at every step in the process I'm about to describe is like the minimal viable product to move on to the next step. There's procrastination and then there's writer procrastination, which is a whole other level. So I don't want to get down into the weeds and end up stalling out my process. So once I have a minimal viable product from the corkboards, I go to color-coded note cards. So kind of like a screenplay would generally be written, how they do it in writers' rooms. So the first thing I do is break the story down into acts. I look at the corkboard and see where the act breaks would be. So a major turning point in the story. It's generally 4 to 5 per book for me in my genre, sometimes 6. And then I take like a blue note card. I write the act. I write what's the polarity shift, having a plan to no plan, or like survival to death or prospect of death. With these major act points, and I write down what the exact turning point is, like what's the exact moment that shift happens for these major act breaks. Then I spread those out. So I have acts, 1 through 5, for example, and then I go to sequences within each act. So I take like a purple note card, and a sequence is 3 to 5 scenes that result in a moderate turning point. So this is all per Robert McKee and his book Story, which is excellent.
Your Lord and Savior.
My Lord and Savior, changed my life, Andrew. Yeah, so the sequences, basically build the act. So I just work on sequences, which could be, 3 to 5 per act. And same thing, what's the polarity shift? What's the exact turning point where that happens? Once I have all the sequences mapped out, and I'm filling in a lot of details as I go here, from the cork board to the note cards, every step you're kind of like getting more fidelity in your story. Once that's done, I spread out the sequences and then I write individual scenes on like a yellow note card. And earlier in my process, I used to do the same thing. What's the polarity shift? What's the exact turning point? Now I'll generally I'll just jot like a scene title on a note card, or if I have any ideas for dialogue or specific things I want to inject, I'll write out as much as I have in my mind at that time, inject all of those into the sequences. Then I take that whole process, like literally take a picture on my phone, pull it up on my computer, and I write the outline, and the outline fleshes in a lot more detail. So each stage in the process kind of goes hand in hand. Each stage is minimal viable product to move on to the next. In particular, going from acts to sequences to scenes fixed any pacing issues that I previously had in my writing. Like whenever I do my rewrites, if there's like a part where the story is lagging, like this fixed all of it, because you're always moving from moderate turning point to sequences that are building into a major turning point of the climax, or the acts rather. And then when you get to the final act, it is the story climax, which is irrefutable turning point from which there is no return for your characters.
You've been writing since 2015, is that right?
Professionally, since late 2016, making any amount of money whatsoever since 2017, 2018. I actually started writing back in like 2007, but I was a closet writer for like 10 years. Most of the work I produced then is unreadable and mercifully will never see the published page. And it was, throughout the years of doing that, when I was actually looking down the barrel of publishing my first book with my name on it, that's when I was like, man, like I rewrote so much. I got the book out there. And then I was like, I can't make a career out of this, like winging it. Some authors can, definitely doesn't work for me. And that's where I started. I got into the study of craft, storytelling, and develop that process. And I think whatever authors want to use, whatever process works for them is good. But I would recommend, especially if you're starting out cold, starting a process and then getting your reps as you write subsequent books and refining it over time, because that's how you'll really streamline your whole process, in my experience.
If you think back, like during that time from when you started writing professionally to now, what are the biggest lessons learned that you've had during that time?
The biggest ones, so study a craft and improving your writing and your story flow, narrative drive kind of comes with experience. I think the biggest lessons learned I've had, one, other than study some craft before you leave your day job and plunge into the abyss of not making money for an unforeseen period of time. The biggest things have been from the marketing perspective. I think writing a killer book one with a complex protagonist who is empathetic in terms of what the reader can identify with in his traits. Doesn't have to be, a Boy Scout. I have yet to write one of those in any of my books, but a killer first book with a great plot, a great main character, great supporting cast is step one. And then after that is continuing that book in series and having enough setups in your first book where it's just, you don't have to know where you're going in your subsequent books, but having enough of a story world that you could see it fleshing out. You could see how different characters come into play, how new characters be added, situations change. Because writing in a series right now, I don't know any authors that are doing this professionally that are writing successive standalones.
Unless they're big five, maybe, or unless they have sort of advantage like that where they...
Yeah, if they're big five, Stephen King, Dean Koontz, who are doing it professionally, contradict everything I just said, they were well established long before the Kindle revolution and the realities of advertising in the current market. So I think writing in series is key, because then what you end up doing with your advertising is pointing all your ads towards book one, getting readers invested in that as the widest part of your funnel, and then they move on to follow-on books. And as your series gets longer and longer, you're scaling your advertising. You can get to the point with a long series where you can actually lose money on book one to draw in new readers, build your audience, break even by book 2 or 3, and then start making money on the rest. If you have a long enough series, that's a possibility, and that's what the most successful independent authors I've seen are doing, because they can afford the higher bid prices, get more eyeballs on their book. Yeah, writing in series and then streamlining your process, as we've discussed, so that you're putting more books out quicker with less burnout for yourself as the author. Oh, and also I'll add having a killer cover design, particularly for book one, that conveys the genre. So for me, at this point, I learned this very quickly. Andrew, you're intimately familiar with my progression, because you were my first cry for help when my wife was like, maybe you should get a job that has a paycheck attached to it. I reached out to you, and that's one of the first things you taught me, which I should have done my research on, to be fair, but I was sociopathically confident. Your book one cover is key. And for me, covers and titles and book descriptions, I'm completely agnostic about. That's purely a marketing decision. So whatever genre you're writing in, look at the top selling books, look at the cover conventions. For me, it's often, there's a shadowy figure running towards a national monument. This has just been done over and over. It's a shadowy figure looking off into the landscape of treacherous looking terrain. Whatever those trends are in your genre, do that. Don't cling to the mindset of like, this is my special baby and I want to differentiate it, because the readers who are taking a chance on your book want to know at a glance when they see if they're lucky enough to see the thumbnail of your cover amidst all the advertising chatter and everything else on Amazon, they need to be able to identify the genre at a glance. The next thing to have in sync is the title should be reflective of the genre in as few words as possible. This is an ever more difficult feat, because more and more books out there, it's hard to do anything that you're not stepping on something. That I've had a book title where I was like, there's no books, there's no movies. I finally found something. And then there's some kid on YouTube who has 12 followers that use this name for his profile. So that's a challenge, but take your time on the title.
Well, I told you not to name the book Mr. Beast, Jason. I mean, so.
I thought it would get clicks.
Yeah.
This is why I have a publisher now. The last thing is the book description. Short, snappy, punchy. Look at other book descriptions in your genre. Throw those into ChatGPT along with your story idea and ask it to generate options for structuring your idea into a book synopsis that mirrors that, your genre's top selling book descriptions, which is often relaying the tropes of the story, whether it's stopping a terrorist attack or romance gets bizarrely specific to the point where they have acronyms for all the different tropes. Make sure those are reflected. And so cover, title, and book description are purely marketing choices in my mind. That's how I would recommend every author approach it. And then the story remains unchanged. And I've got my first book, I think it's been through 3 or 4 different covers. I've changed the series name. And not one word of the story has been altered. So get the readers in with the wide funnel conveying your genre, get them to take a chance on you. And then once they get into your story and you hook them, you as the artist can do whatever you want creatively.
So I'm like breaking, whether it's the fourth wall or something, but Catherine, you probably read more romance than Jason and I do.
Statistically, yeah.
Statistically, yes, I would.
Because he mentioned that. And are you familiar with like the different acronyms that describe like what the plot of the story is? Do you know what he's talking about when he says that?
I don't.
Like an HEA, right? Like happily ever after ending. Have you seen that in the descriptions?
No, I haven't. I think that might be just a writer thing and maybe not a reader thing.
I'll show you, but I've seen like several. I mean, I think there's a zillion, but I've seen several romance. They have like all these acronyms in them that describe like what the different plot, like 2 guys and a girl, like love
like
triangle or something like that. Yeah. So it basically has like, it's not even in English. And like, I wouldn't be able to tell you what all the acronyms mean, but there's like 2 or 3 lines of like straight up acronyms like, across the description. And then it gets to the book description. And I'm like, people that can read that hieroglyphics know exactly what's going on in the book and they know whether it's right for them. But like, it's crazy. The progression of these are all 99-cent books for the most part in romance, Kindle Unlimited.
We'll pause.
It's funny.
Probably a good call.
As someone who doesn't have a military background, but who has read excerpts of your books, in thrillers, how do you approach writing action and combat scenes to ensure that they are both realistic and accessible to readers without a military background?
Realistic is just a matter of not jumping the shark. I don't take any shark. If you're not familiar with that phrase, look it up. It'll be worth your time. I don't do anything in my books that is not feasible, done in practice or is not in line with the laws of physics, which is a lesson that Hollywood has yet to learn when they're trying to be accurate with military thrillers. I don't know who they consult with, but in your books, it's just a matter of having people reload, having realistic lines of sight, fire and maneuver during a gunfight. In terms of being accessible to readers, I'll describe whatever piece of equipment. Let's say there's an aircraft, and I'll provide, the nomenclature. This is the description of what it looks like. This is what it does. And then I will on with the story, and it serves its purpose. So readers who are not familiar can kind of have an idea of what it appears as, how it would look, what it does. And then with stuff like acronyms, so I try to stay away from them, but there's times where, people are communicating on the radio, real world, they're going to use an acronym. Nobody is going to say all 3 words or whatever, particularly in a gunfight. So I will say, what the acronym is. So the radio chatter is realistic. And then I'll have the character's perspective oftentimes saying like the term that so-and-so referenced, dash, spell it out, like what it is, and then what it means. So I never have an acronym occur without an explanation.
Personal experience in story creation. Have any of your extreme sports experiences, because I know you've done base jumping, you've been an ultramarathon runner. Have any of those directly inspired a suspenseful scene in your novels? And can you share an example of that?
My main character, David Rivers' first book I wrote with him, he was an active base jumper. And I've got, one particular base jump sequence off a, 250-foot antenna that is play-by-play, exact replication of one specific jump I did. Like the emotions, the adrenaline, the visuals, everything. It's a specific antenna, like across the Hudson from West Point overlooking the school. I can say it now because I'm not going to burn myself and get kicked out. that is, a rare example of a direct translation. More commonly, it would be something like skydiving, where, I've got a team military freefall jump, and the sensations before you jump, the leap off the ramp, the feel, the becoming unstable, assuming the body position required to level out after you hit terminal velocity after 10 seconds, the process of linking up with people midair, hearing your audible altimeter go off when you hit your hard deck to break away, turning, tracking away, so everybody has as much room as possible in their canopy deployment, prevent entanglements and everything. That is, taking the building blocks of an actual experience in translating it. Ultra marathon, certainly for the levels of physical exhaustion, particularly approaching, the end of a book where people have been running with minimal sleep for 3 days. Something I told my readers recently on my reader newsletter was, going into the 10th book, I was like, man, I'm fatigued. I'm at the end of my rope. It's not like, oh, I want to quit, but it's mile 90 of an ultra marathon, like a 100-mile race, where what you came there for, it is what you want to do. You're not going to stop until you're finished, but at the same time, you're looking down the barrel. You've been awake for 24 hours and you're just hitting that grueling level of physical resistance that you have to push through, which is a pretty good metaphor for writing. It's helped me frame my writing experience, especially when you're coming up on the end of a series, of just accepting that's where you're at, not burning out, pacing yourself.
So you mentioned your reader newsletter, and we know that you have just a massive readership, but not only just a consistent readership, an active readership. They actively want to interact with you and talk about your books together. So what kind of reader response have stood out to you the most, whether that is surprising or just particularly meaningful?
What I love getting is emails from the military guys, including the old vets, the retired law enforcement guys, the active law enforcement guys, first responders that have been in traumatic, high adrenaline situations that reach out and are like, you nailed it. Like this is what it was like. This was, cathartic to read. Also, in particular, when people identify with the aspects of trauma and the post-traumatic stress and the fallout from combat that the characters are dealing with, when they reach out and say that mirror their own processes, or that's, helping them contextualize what they're going through, that is by and large the audience I'm writing for. I approach books writing for that audience, and whoever else enjoys it's great. And I think the readers without those backgrounds do enjoy getting those aspects of authenticity that go beyond most action thrillers, where it's, a hero on his moral high horse that never makes any decisions in the gray, everything's black and white. I think readers, even without those backgrounds, appreciate the nuanced approach and seeing the characters, the thematic counterpoints to what they're going through. So that's been the most rewarding thing for me.
I think your authenticity in your writing is it's in the top 0.1% of fiction writers that I know. Disclaimer,
this is my publisher talking, but go on.
This is me, regardless of our friendship or the fact that, we have a business relationship. You are excellent at the authenticity side. And a big part of that is you've had a very interesting life experience. The other area where I think you're in probably the top 1% of writers that I know is you are a student of craft. I come to you with questions on craft all the time. There's a reason for that. So if you're a newer author, or, even just an author that wants to improve their own abilities when it comes to craft, what are your recommendations on what they do or what they read?
Okay, so step one, don't do anything that I did in the opening years of my career. I approach writing with the immature artist mindset of, this is my special baby. I'm tired of all the cliches that I've seen in this genre, and I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to make it different. It's going to be original. It's going to be unique, which is fine. However, my writing really got better after the panicked, feverish rush of trying to get my first book across the finish line, when I was like, I can't, I was way too stressful to ever replicate. And it was too hit or miss. I hit it on that first book, I hope, but I couldn't do that. It was a lightning strike that I didn't want to gamble on, particularly wanting to do writing full time. So I think what really helped me was immediately after that, I started studying storytelling craft, story structure. And once I did that, I could see not only how to contextualize and place the events in my future books, but also where I could meaningfully subvert the rules in a way that surprises and delights readers, not as an ego thing of trying to be so different and so special and so unique, which I think, has the risk of alienating a lot of readers, but understanding within the story structure, okay, this is how things go for 99% of stories. And for the 1% that are successful and violate that, it is done by experienced artists who started with the basics, and then they learned how to meaningfully subvert certain rules for the benefit of the overall work. With regard to specific craft to study, the two books I always recommend, one is Story by Robert McKee. That's been kind of my Bible, especially going in. It's a very broad level understanding of story in the infinite variations it could take. And he's big on, there's no right or wrong in how you approach the work, but there is better and worse. And when you make a decision, you make any one of the number of infinite decisions you have to make in the course of producing a book or a story of any type. It becomes about like making the best decision for this book or for this story and where you're trying to head with the plot. That being said, the book, it can read like a textbook at times. I used to read it in between each book I wrote. So I've probably gone through it, a half dozen times to let stuff sink in. Most of the viewers here are smarter than me. So, once or twice might do the trick. There's a very broad overview, something you should definitely get around to eventually, if not immediately. Especially if you just got a vague idea, you're just getting started, like I would make that book your first stop. If you already have an idea, or as is the case with me at one point, you don't know how to write the intro to a story that you've otherwise completely fleshed out, turn to a book that I was recommended by a very experienced, very prolific author. I read 10% of it and I was like, oh, this is too cliche, again, earlier in my career. And I threw it aside and it collected dust until I hit that aforementioned point where I had no idea how to do the intro or the lead into a story. I pulled it right back out. I read it voraciously. And that book is Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody. Do not read the original Save the Cat book. Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody is what you want to go to. So she goes over the general story structure, pretty much everything you need to know top to bottom. And then she analyzes various novels of various genres, breaks them down into those plot points so you can have an idea of how it works. Some of the books I read before, others I read to see how it went and to see how it followed that progression. Notably, there's a Stephen King book on there. And Stephen King famously is not a plotter. And most people, I've talked to a decent number of authors and writers who are like, well, Stephen King doesn't plot, so I'm not going to. And the one thing they've read about writing is his book on writing. However, Jessica Brody takes a book of his and breaks it down into all those like 15 plot points, which it goes with in lockstep. The point being, some people, aka Stephen King, have been writing for so long and have consumed so many books in the course of their career and progression as an author that there are things they will do intuitively that for a beginning author might not be so intuitive.
So it's like instinctual with him. Yeah,
I think he's had books where he doesn't follow his plot points, and I'm like, why is he sprawling? You're like, what is he talking? Why am I getting a 5-page background on this character? He's going to exit stage right. On the 6th page, I'm never going to hear from again, which is, it's his style. It's one of the things a lot of people write about his books, and you certainly need to explore the space when you're writing. Jessica Brody's book takes you through all of that, gives you the examples, and then has a process to apply, namely the cork board I've just described. She lays it out. So I integrated that. My process is basically starting with Jessica Brody's cork board for the general story progression, and then going to Robert McKee's recommendation that he particularly goes to if anybody wants to jump to the Cliffs Notes. The last chapter in his book Story is called Writing from the Inside Out. And that's where he advocates, the note card approach, getting everything structured in your mind before you start writing. It's a lesson I learned the hard way. So I kind of fuse those two approaches, and those two books would be my recommendation for starting out.
So for more readers rather than writers, if a new reader is brand new to your work, which book would you recommend them start with and why? I
would say The Enemies of My Country, which is the first book in the Shadow Strike series. I'm in the rewrites process for book 10 of that series. Why? It's a series starter. I'm always dismayed when I see, a review or get a piece of email. It's like, well, I I started book 5, but I was kind of fuzzy on what was going on. And it's like, well, yeah, like if you jump into Breaking Bad season 3, you're going to be a bit lost. Don't be one of those weirdos. Start with a book 1 of whatever series you want to read. For my work, I do The Enemies of My Country. And if you like it, you can binge read as far as you want up to what will soon be books 9 and 10, which are waiting to be published. So that's where I'd go.
Amazing. What writing project do you have on the horizon? Every reader's favorite question and every writer's worst nightmare.
Yeah, well, the worst nightmare part is pretty applicable for me right now. So I finished book 10, or I'm on the tail end of rewrites for book 10. And I'm going to start an entirely new series because whenever I've done this, I've written 3 series, and with each new series, I want to push my comfort zone. A very experienced author once told me, like, whenever your writing is improved by an order of magnitude, start a new series. That's what I'm trying to do at this point, because I just sent book 10 of Shadow Strike to the editor. I have no idea what that series is going to be. I've had a lot of ideas, and I've started fleshing them out. On all of them, decided, like, this isn't it. Like, this isn't big enough. Like, I could write this, but it's not like next level. Again, not anything my publisher wants to hear right now. But yeah, for what my next project is, that is an excellent question that I'm still trying to figure out myself.
And we look forward to hearing more on that. Thank you so much, Jason, for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.